As we move further into the year 2025, many analysts are trying to predict which countries might face serious economic crises this year. Often crises are not caused by just one thing, but by a build-up of structural problems, poor management, unfavorable external situations, or in many cases a combination of all of these. While some countries grapples with historical problems that resurface time and again, others face unforeseen surprises, even when their economies seemed relatively stable. One of the most alarming examples is Sri Lanka. This country, famous for its tropical landscapes and rich culture, is currently experiencing one of the worst financial crises in its history. For years, its economy was sustained by international loans for infrastructure projects and a heavy reliance on tourism. However, the devastating effects of the pandemic, internal political conflicts, and the global increase in fuel and food prices have created a perfect storm. In 2022, Sri Lanka defaulted on its foreign debt, and although the International Monetary Fund approved a bailout, the reforms needed to access these funds have sparked massive protests. With foreign currency reserves practically depleted, inflation exceeding 50% in 2023, and the inability to import essential goods, poverty and social unrest are reaching historic levels. Bangladesh, another country that seemed to be booming thanks to its position as the world's second largest textile exporter, is also under pressure. Although its textile industry has been a key driver of development, its high dependence on international brands and internal problems such as labour unrest, low wages, and lack of economic diversification put it at risk. Inflation, fueled by the global energy crisis and currency devaluation, has driven up the prices of basic foodstuffs, increasing poverty among the most vulnerable populations. Furthermore, the lack of structural reforms in key areas such as infrastructure and education threatens to stall its long-term growth. North Korea, although known for its secrecy, faces serious economic problems that can no longer be hidden. International isolation and strict sanctions have limited its foreign trade options, while dependence on China for essential goods and raw materials has not been enough to avert the crisis. Added to this are internal problems such as food shortages, poor harvests, and a highly centralized economy that does not respond to the needs of its people. Recent reports suggest that malnutrition has reached critical levels, with thousands of people facing severe food insecurity. Venezuela remains a prime example of a protracted crisis. Despite possessing one of the world's largest oil reserves, decades of corruption, mismanagement, and a collapse in oil production have left the country in dire straits. Although there were attempts at recovery in 2024 due to a slight improvement in international oil prices, export earnings have not been enough to alleviate hyperinflation or significantly improve living conditions. Mass emigration has continued, with more than 7 million Venezuelans living abroad, exacerbating the brain drain and further reducing prospects for recovery. In Africa, Zimbabwe has struggled for decades with the consequences of failed political and economic decisions. Formerly known as the breadbasket of Africa, the country has faced a severe agricultural and financial crisis since the early 2000s. The partial dollarization of its economy has provided some temporary stability, but the lack of confidence in local financial institutions, coupled with an unsustainable external debt and inflation rates that erode the purchasing power of its population, keeps the country in a precarious situation. Moreover, corruption and the lack of effective land reforms remain barriers to progress. Greece, although it managed to weather the worst of its debt crisis in the last decade, still faces serious structural problems. Its high public debt, which in 2025 is still over 170% of its GDP, remains a difficult burden to manage, especially in a context of slow economic growth. Despite its reliance on tourism, which accounts for a significant portion of its GDP, the lack of economic diversification and an unsustainable pension system keep the country vulnerable to new crises. High youth unemployment rates and the emigration of skilled workers to other European Union countries worsen the situation. leaving Greece in a fragile position. In Asia, Myanmar is undergoing a severe political and economic crisis following the 2021 coup. International sanctions, the withdrawal of foreign companies, and a lack of investor confidence have stifled economic growth, while internal protests and ethnic conflicts exacerbate instability. In addition, the disruption of natural gas exports and the halting of major infrastructure projects have left the country in a delicate position, with rising inflation and a collapse in the quality of life for its people. Although Belgium does not usually appear on lists of countries in crisis, its high public debt, which is around 106% of GDP, and internal tensions between the Flemish and Walloon regions pose significant risks. The economy, highly dependent on international trade, also faces pressure from inflation and high energy costs, which could impact its long-term economic stability. In addition, internal political divisions make it difficult to implement the structural reforms needed to sustain growth. Argentina is another emblematic case of chronic instability. With repeated cycles of boom and bust, the country is once again facing serious challenges. Inflation that closed 2024 at 120%, a critical level of debt, and a heavily dollarized economy that makes any room for maneuver difficult. Despite having enormous natural resources and productive capacity, political uncertainty and inconsistent economic policies have prevented it from achieving lasting stability. Constant renegotiations with the IMF and lack of investor confidence worsen the situation. Finally, El Salvador faces an uncertain future after adopting Bitcoin as legal tender. Although the move was touted as a strategy to attract investment and modernize its economy, the high volatility of the cryptocurrency has created uncertainty. The lack of transparency in its implementation, combined with rising public debt and an economy dependent on remittances, puts the country in a vulnerable position, especially if it fails to stabilize its revenues and diversify its economy. The population, for its part, has shown skepticism, which has led to limited adoption of Bitcoin as a payment method. Ultimately, the common lesson among these countries is that no economy is fully shielded. Crises can be triggered by miscalculated internal decisions, unforeseen external events, or a combination of both. However, there is also room for resilience. The key lies in the ability of governments and societies to adapt and learn from their mistakes, creating stronger foundations for the future.